I watched my wife listen to her friends talk about lovers. At first, I laughed inwardly, thinking it was all an exaggeration, those conversations over glasses of wine and leering glances that never led anywhere. But something about her smile bothered me. A different kind of smile, embarrassed, almost complicit, like someone sharing a memory and not just an opinion. I tried to ignore it. I tried to trust. Trust is what holds anything together. But there comes a moment when trust dissolves silently, like a frayed rope that snaps before it even snaps. That's when I started to notice more. Details that had previously gone unnoticed, the cell phone always face down, the disappearance during work breaks, the long, furtive showers with the phone hidden among her clothes. Once, I saw a name light up on the screen and her smile came before I even unlocked it. My heart froze, but I said nothing. Silence has its own way of screaming. I started checking. Not out of obsession, but out of a need to breathe truth. And what I discovered, was the kind of pain that has no sound. Messages, meetings arranged during work hours, intimate nicknames. It wasn't just a fling. It was affection. It was surrender. It was the kind of care she should have saved for me. She smiled when she read, "I'll wait for you at the usual corner," and said she was swamped with work. She lied with shining eyes and then lay down beside me, cold as a changed pillow. At no point until then had she suspected I knew. And perhaps that was my greatest revenge, letting her lie until the end. There was no scandal, no confrontation. I simply printed the papers, left them on the living room table, and when she arrived, she looked startled, trying to understand. "It's already done. Go on your way," was all she said. She tried to deny it, cried, held me by the arms, saying it was a mistake, a moment of confusion, that the other guy was just a distraction from something she couldn't even explain. But the truth was already screaming, from every corner of the house, inside me, for every minute of silence that I endured. I spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, trying to understand where everything began to go wrong. And the worst part of all was remembering the times I'd come home tired and she'd say she was exhausted too, when in fact she'd just given herself to someone else. The betrayal wasn't just in her body, it was in her gestures, in the small omissions, in the lack of eye contact. After she left home, dragging suitcases and memories with her, I had to relearn how to live. The day after the divorce was finalized, I sat on the porch and cried. For the first time. Because now, it wasn't anger anymore, it was grief. The grief of someone who lost someone who was still alive. The grief of a dead marriage with a hot body by her side. I got rid of the photos, rearranged the furniture, but every inch of the house still breathed her scent. Her pillow still dipped as if waiting for her face. I stayed away from the places we used to frequent together. The coffee shop on the corner. The bakery on the back street. I avoided our friends, because every look carried questions and compassion. And I didn't want compassion. I wanted peace. Time passed, and with it, the anger settled. I didn't forget. But I accepted it. The scars shaped me. And one day, unplanned, I met someone. Her gaze was calm. Her silence was welcoming. There was truth even in what she didn't say. Without promises, she offered me presence. And there, slowly, I felt something blossom. For the first time, someone listened to me without judging, smiled with their eyes, touched me lightly and not with guilt. We began to walk together, unhurriedly, but with direction. Meanwhile, the other woman followed a different path. She persisted with her lover. She believed he would leave everything. But he didn't. Because men like that don't leave. They just enjoy. She renovated the apartment where we lived. She took our photos, painted the walls, bought new furniture. But she couldn't change the smell of absence. And every corner of the house began to haunt her with memories of what she had lost. Where there had once been laughter, now there was only echo. The refrigerator we bought together was still there, the couch we watched movies on, the pillows we picked out. Everything spoke of me, even after she tried to erase it. She called me. Once, twice. She said she wanted to talk. I went. For myself. To close things. Not to reopen. And when we saw each other, she cried. She said she felt empty. That the other had left. That the passion was gone and she only realized too late what she had at home. You were my peace, and I traded it for beautiful chaos. Now I understand. I listened. Not for her, but for myself. Because I needed to hear it to finish my story. I simply said, I forgive you. Not to start over. But to free you. And free myself too. I got up and left. And for the first time, she didn't chase me. The pain of betrayal isn't just about being betrayed, but about knowing you gave everything, and still, it wasn't enough for the other person to respect you. And this pain doesn't go away. But it teaches us. It teaches us to love better. To choose more calmly. To value ourselves. Today, I'm living a different story. Quieter. More sincere. There's no happy ending when there's betrayal, but there is a new beginning. There is reconstruction. And perhaps, peace is the greatest happy ending of all. But, there's still a part of this story I've never told anyone. Something that happened before the divorce. A detail she never discovered, and perhaps, if she had, everything would have ended differently. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of cheating is condoned or romanticized. All the stories you'll hear are fictional, created to show how infidelity corrodes, destroys, and leaves deep scars on the lives of those who experience it. The moral is clear: cheating is never worth it. Now, get ready, because what you're about to hear is an intense, emotional, and shocking story. Daniel and Laura met on an ordinary late afternoon, one of those days when nothing seems to herald any change. He was sitting alone in a coffee shop, immersed in a time-worn book, when she walked in, naturally smoothing her hair that fell over her face, as if unaware that she attracts attention wherever she goes. There was no rush to approach, just a simple coincidence: the last free seat was at his table. A quick request, a shy smile, and a conversation that began with short, hesitant sentences. Gradually, the silence between them went from awkward to comfortable. That was the starting point, the moment two distinct worlds collided silently, but with enough force to change everything that would come after. Daniel was a man of stable habits, the kind who prefers the familiar to improvisation, who believes that love is built daily, more through the effort to maintain what already exists than through grand, unexpected gestures. He worked with dedication, without extravagant ambitions, but with the certainty that life, however simple, could be full if shared with someone who understood him. Laura, on the other hand, was the opposite in many ways. She had a vibrant energy, a taste for the unexpected, a sparkle in her eyes that seemed to always beg for novelty. She liked to reinvent herself, to move furniture around, to try new paths even when the old ones still worked. This difference, far from driving them apart, was what brought them together. He offered her the security of a solid rock, and she offered him the lightness of someone who knows how to laugh at her own uncertainties. Their courtship turned into marriage almost naturally. There wasn't a single moment when they decided, but rather a succession of days when living together seemed inevitable, when being apart felt like an artificial effort. Friends said they were the perfect balance, two halves who complemented each other without canceling each other out. At the altar, Daniel looked at Laura as if looking at destiny, and she responded with a smile so sincere it seemed to promise eternity. The first years were filled with simple discoveries: cooking together, decorating their first apartment, arguing over curtain colors, and laughing when the bedroom painting didn't turn out as expected. Life was shaped around their routine, between lingering hugs, little notes left on the fridge, and end-of-day conversations about nothing and everything. Their apartment became more than a physical space. It was a living space, where every corner held a piece of their shared history. The living room sofa held the memory of endless movie nights, where Laura would fall asleep before the end and Daniel, laughing, would carry her to the bedroom. The small, narrow balcony witnessed deep conversations during late nights when neither of them could sleep. The kitchen was Laura's territory, always inventing recipes, while Daniel tried to help, hindering more than contributing. Even so, she laughed and said the important thing was being together. Every detail of the house exuded intimacy, as if the walls were accomplices in a love under construction. At gatherings with friends, they were seen as a solid couple, the example many used as a benchmark of companionship. Daniel enjoyed watching Laura in these moments, speaking animatedly, laughing loudly, charming everyone with her outgoing nature. He felt proud to have her by his side, as if he had found something rare that needed to be preserved. She, on the other hand, would often hug him mid-conversation, silently squeezing his hand, as if reminding herself that there was a safe haven waiting for her. These gestures fueled his conviction that they were building something lasting, immune to the ravages of time. But life isn't all smiles and complicity. The gray days also arrived, when routine weighed more heavily than the lightness of the early years. Daniel immersed himself more and more in his work, believing that providing stability was the greatest demonstration of love he could offer. Laura, accustomed to movement, began to miss novelty, surprises, something that would break the predictable rhythm of the days. Late-night conversations became shorter, fatigue taking over the space where once there had been shared stories. Still, they remained together, believing that ups and downs were part of any true relationship. There were times when Laura would gaze out the living room window, silent, as if searching for something beyond what she saw. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. He thought it was just fatigue, perhaps longing for things they hadn't experienced, and believed that in time she would smile like before. He tried to compensate with small gestures, flowers on ordinary days, messily prepared dinners, plans for short weekend getaways. Laura thanked him and smiled, but the sparkle in her eyes seemed to have lost its former spark. Daniel tried hard to suppress his insecurity, telling himself that love was strong enough to overcome any phase. The days piled up, each carrying a bit of unspoken silence, unshared desires, postponed gestures. Still, there was love. There was affection in the way he arranged the blanket over her when she slept, and there was tenderness in the quick kiss she left on his cheek before leaving the house. It wasn't a perfect love, but it was real, made of presence, of imperfections that complemented each other. Deep down, they both believed that, despite their differences, they had found in each other what most spend their entire lives searching for. What neither of them could have imagined was that, amidst this seemingly stable routine, small choices would begin to shape different paths. Choices that seemed insignificant at the time, but which, taken together, would forever change the way they viewed each other and the very life they had built. There were no clear signs yet, just a subtle distance, a faint feeling that something was off. Like nearly invisible cracks in a solid wall, which only time would fully reveal. And it was in this silent interval, between what seemed intact and what was preparing to crumble, that the true story began to be written. Daniel and Laura's mornings had their own rhythm, a rhythm that seemed to have been found through coexistence and kindness. They woke before the sun, exchanging a few meaningful words, she calmly drinking coffee while he scanned the news, in no rush to discuss the world because the world inside was already complex enough. On Fridays, they reversed their cooking habits. He would venture into pasta, she would meticulously chop tomatoes, laughing when he made the overly seasoned sauce. Their apartment, theirs alone, seemed to absorb this discreet music, with the table marked with memories, the bookshelf full of underlined books, a painting hanging crooked since they moved in because neither of them wanted to undo the mistake that had become an intimate joke. There was, however, a glimmer of fresh air creeping in under the doors, almost imperceptible at first, just a different temperature that lingered throughout the days and left a trail of silence at the end of their conversations. Daniel felt something without knowing how to name it, and Laura, without admitting it even to herself, was already walking a few steps ahead of a place that had previously been her destiny. Gradually, the nights that ended on the couch with movies and whispers shifted to quick dinners, late texts, last-minute appointments that popped up unplanned. Laura began returning late, citing unexpected meetings, and Daniel tried not to turn his curiosity into accusation because he knew the pressure work put on those who still had ambition and fire in their eyes. He chose trust, as he always had. In return, he offered simple gestures that quietly said he was still there. He left the porch light on, warmed the dish she would bring to the table on her tired 10:30 face, made room in bed next to her as if making way for the other's rest. When she arrived, he smiled briefly and said everything was fine, it was just a rush, and the restrained, almost automatic kiss carried the weight of someone wanting to end a conversation before it even began. The next morning, Daniel made a slightly stronger coffee, as if the drink could dissolve the strange taste of half-finished words. Weekends, once planned with short 2-hour adventures in the park, an exhibition, a street market where they discussed pieces they wouldn't buy, began to fall through for trivial reasons. A rainy Saturday was enough for Laura to want to be alone in her room, to get her head together, and Daniel understood, respected, and didn't force smiles that weren't ready. Instead of insisting, he sought out new ways to surprise her. He'd reserve a table at a charming place, buy tickets to a play, leave a note on her nightstand with a simple invitation and a promise not to ask questions. Sometimes it worked, and the evening stretched out with wine, a sincere smile, a photo they said they'd keep to remind them they were still on the same side. Other times, she'd announce late in the afternoon that she couldn't go, something came up that I can't postpone, and Daniel would say it was okay, it had always been okay, while something inside him shrank just a little more. The friends sensed a change they weren't sure how to address. When they were all together, Laura struggled to play the part of the enchanter, and Daniel, proud and attentive, accompanied her, planting kisses on her forehead, adjusting her coat on her shoulders when a sudden wind interrupted an outdoor conversation. Those encounters were a kind of stage, where both reaffirmed that there was enough affection to sustain the story. Later, on the way home, the car would cruise through the streets with a small but tangible distance between their hands. He would ask if everything was okay, and she would answer yes without offering details, preferring to lean her head against the window, crossing the city with the eyes of someone looking inward. Daniel preferred to believe in the kinder version of reality: life changes, love breathes differently, sometimes fatigue is just fatigue. He put his apprehensions away in an invisible drawer, promising himself to open it when he was ready to deal with whatever came out. The signs multiplied subtly. Laura's cell phone, previously forgotten in any corner of the room, became an object she kept close by, always with the screen facing down. Notifications arrived frequently at unlikely times, and she learned to smile with the corner of her mouth, as if trying to hide a reflex. Daniel noticed, but chose not to monitor what he didn't want to turn into evidence. There was no discussion, no direct question, there was careful observation, a mental notebook where he jotted things down without judgment. One night, while she was showering, a message appeared on her watch forgotten on the table, a luminous rectangle announcing, "I miss you today." He looked away with a conscious effort, like someone stopping themselves from walking through a locked door, and took a deep breath so that anxiety wouldn't find a home in the room. When she returned, drying her hair, he had set the table, 2 simple plates, the embroidered tablecloth she loved. Laura smiled as if nothing was different, thanked him for his care, and the two had dinner talking about the film that would be released the following weekend. Daniel decided to pursue deeper conversations without spilling all the distrust. He gently suggested they take some time off, turn off their phones, and allow themselves to resume the small practices that had always done them good. Laura seemed relieved to accept, and that week continued with lighter messages, promises of a Saturday on the road, a return without a time or destination, just the two of them and some heartwarming music. However, on Friday afternoon, she called in a hurried voice, saying a last-minute request would make their promised getaway impossible, asking for understanding, and promising to make up for it on Sunday with a hearty breakfast. Daniel, with his suitcase already leaning against the door, smiled inwardly so as not to spoil the moment and replied that it was okay, we'll go next time. He hung up and, instead of unpacking, wandered aimlessly around the house, touching objects that now seemed to belong to an older version of the story. The bookshelf, the picture frames, the plant that had survived 2 moves, the smell of laundry in the hallway brought back the kind of morning one feels for what still exists. There was one particularly long night, a birthday for both of them that fell on a Tuesday, yet Daniel gave it a Saturday feel. He prepared a modest dinner, which he knew how to make well, and left on her plate an envelope with a card written slowly, measured words, without exaggeration, promising he would be there for her on both the easy days and the rough ones. Laura arrived late, visibly tired, surprised by the table, kissed him on the cheek, and read the card with a smile that never quite faded. She apologized for not being able to buy him a gift, explaining that the week had been too busy. Daniel said he didn't need anything, that she was enough. They dined in near silence, and at the end, she got up, saying she needed to respond to an urgent message, out of the blue, now, and disappeared into the bedroom. He remained seated, staring at the candle that insisted on burning slowly to the end, as if the flame had more patience than either of them. When she returned, she blew out the candle with an automatic puff, kissed him on the forehead, and said a belated "Happy Birthday" that flew across the room like a lost bird. The following Saturday, Daniel decided he would do something different. He woke early, quietly left, bought her favorite flowers, and gave the car a thorough cleaning, as if the shiny exterior could summon the sparkle within. When he returned, he found Laura on the balcony, staring into space, phone in hand. He approached, handed her the flowers, and she smiled a genuine thank you that was short-lived. She said she needed to go out for a bit, just something quick, and that she would be back before lunch. Daniel offered to accompany her, but she declined with a forced affection, almost a request not to insist. He didn't insist. He saw the door close, heard the elevator descend, and stood in the middle of the living room with one bouquet less and one question more. He sat on the sofa, tilted his head back, and closed his eyes, trying to hear some response in the silence of the apartment. When he opened his eyes, he noticed a banal detail: her perfume in the air was different, sweeter, more recent, a scent he hadn't recognized in her drawers. And this small strangeness was what led him, without fanfare, to move Sunday to attentive solitude. The following weeks were an exercise in subtlety. Daniel stopped announcing plans, stopped inviting, offered space as if offering respect, and filled his own days with activities that no longer depended on a return. He began walking in the late afternoon, discovered a path through the streets where the wind was softer, a stand that held old newspapers, a fruit stand where he learned to ask about what was in season. On these walks, he thought of Laura fondly and with a sadness that didn't demand revenge, just an honest understanding of what had become difficult to sustain. He wanted to believe that this phase would be just a phase, that soon the two would reunite over a laugh and a coffee. But something in him, quiet for months, began to demand less poetic answers. It was as if the house itself whispered that there was a story running parallel, a narrative where he wasn't the protagonist. Even so, he chose to wait, not out of cowardice, but so that the words wouldn't be thrown like knives, but rather laid on the table with the dignity that had always existed between them. It was late in the afternoon, returning early, that the first crack became less than discreet. Daniel had forgotten an important folder and returned home in the rush of someone who needed to grab a document and disappear. Upon opening the door, he noticed soft music coming from the bedroom. He called out, but there was no answer. He walked slowly down the hallway and saw her sitting on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, her face lit up by a conversation that seemed too light to be work. Not wanting to startle her, he knocked lightly on the door and said he would just come by to get the folder and then leave again. Laura was startled, hid the phone on an impulse that clashed with the naturalness of someone with nothing to hide, and then smiled, explaining that she was just sorting out a silly problem. He tried to believe her. He picked up the folder and, as he walked back through the door, saw reflected in the mirror a heart drawn on a piece of paper on the nightstand, a recent scribble that wasn't in her handwriting. He continued on his way as if he hadn't seen, clutching the briefcase tightly enough to crumple it. That night, Daniel watched Laura with an old affection and a new distance. She seemed lighter than in recent days, as if a tension had been resolved far away. He listened to every word, every pause, every breath, trying to decipher a language that now sounded foreign to him. When they went to sleep, she quickly turned onto her side, pulling the blanket up to her neck, and he lay with his eyes open in the darkness, feeling the ceiling descend a little on him. He didn't sleep. The early morning was filled with breaks, cups of water, and restrained steps so as not to wake her. At dawn, he finally decided to stop protecting himself from the clues. He wouldn't look for a fight, but neither would he turn his face away from what seemed to be asking to be seen. It was a silent commitment to himself, the kind of decision that changes the course of a life without anyone around immediately noticing. The following days were filled with coincidences that didn't seem like coincidences. A message she read with a smile and then deleted, a perfume that wasn't hers on the coat that came back from the hanger, a receipt for a coffee shop in a neighborhood not on her commute, a new playlist that popped up on his phone with songs neither of them usually listened to. Daniel made a mental note, without excess, without paranoia. One afternoon, he passed the downtown cafe and recognized Laura's scarf through the window, draped over the chair. Did he go in? No. Not then. A friend called him from across the street, struck up a conversation, and he chose to postpone any glance that would powerfully change everything. She returned home with cold hands and her heart pointing in a direction he still refused to accept. That night, he made soup, set a plate on the table, and waited. Laura arrived late again, apologized again, said she was exhausted again. He responded with an "I understand" that, for the first time, didn't come across as a concession, but as an acknowledgement. Then came the night of persistent rain, those thick drops that wash over the streets and soak even intentions. Laura said she was stopping by a friend's house to lighten the week and sleep more lightly. Daniel nodded into the phone, wished her some rest, and sat at the kitchen table listening to the rain fill the hallways. When he got up to put his things away, Laura's phone vibrated on the counter. She had forgotten it in a hurry on the way out. The screen lit up with a preview of a message that didn't include a name, just a number, and said, "I'll be waiting for you at the usual place at 8 p.m. Daniel stood still for a few seconds, then took a breath and looked away, as he had the first time. He walked to the living room, put on his coat, grabbed his keys, and when he touched the doorknob, he went back and picked up his phone. He didn't open anything, didn't unlock it, didn't look for it. He put it in his pocket like someone keeping a mirror that needs to be faced in another room. He went out into the night, the rain beating down on his face with the honesty that was missing in the house, and drove without maps, guided by a calm impulse that only someone deeply wounded can cultivate. He arrived at the cafe he knew from so many past afternoons and a recent coincidence. He parked with steady hands, his heart racing, and entered without raising his head. The place smelled of ground coffee and low conversation. He chose a table in the back, within sight of the door, and waited. Long minutes passed, each one weighing like a year on the table. When the clock on the wall struck 8 p.m., the door opened, and she entered, umbrella-less, her hair damp, her coat dark. She wore a smile Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. She sat at the table by the window, and soon after, a man approached, greeted her with an intimacy that didn't ask for permission, and the two leaned toward each other as if picking up where a conversation left off. Daniel looked away, not out of embarrassment, but to allow himself to breathe. He ordered a coffee that he didn't drink, put his hand in his pocket and felt the vibration of his forgotten phone, and suddenly the entire room went silent, as if the world understood that this was the moment when something stops being an assumption and turns into stone. He didn't make a scene, didn't raise his voice, didn't knock over chairs. He stayed where he was, observing without judgment, recognizing gestures that had once been his and now belonged to another story. When he stood, it was with the calm of someone who knows that life gives a few warnings and then offers periods without punctuation. He left money on the table for the untouched coffee, walked to the door, and took one last look out the window. He saw Laura laugh at something he wouldn't hear, saw her hand touch his on the table, saw the sincerity of that moment that, no matter how painful, could not be denied. He walked out into the rain without opening his umbrella, sat in the car, and closed his eyes. He didn't cry. Not there. He started the engine, waited a few seconds, and as the windshield swept away the water that tried to block his view of the road, he made the decision that would change everything. At home, he would put in order what needed to be, silently, with the same dignity with which he loved. There was still something she never knew, a detail hidden away where only definitive decisions could be made, and which would be left for later, exactly when the story demanded its due. The rain continued to beat on the glass, persistent, almost compassionate, as Daniel drove back, knowing that from that point on, nothing would be told the same way. The boxes were still stacked when the bricklayers began to break down the bedroom wall, and the dull thud of sledgehammers pierced the apartment as if opening a passage to new life through the force of cement and dust. Laura walked through the rooms with a clipboard in her hands, trying to give orders that sounded firm but barely contained the trembling in her fingers. She had decided to redo everything, replace the flooring, paint the ceiling, open skylights where there were none, as if light could banish old shadows. She told herself she needed a fresh start, and that a fresh start requires courage, fresh paint, and new furniture. When they heard the sound of something other than the cracking of the brick, one of the young men called out to her, pointing to the hole in the plaster of the removed built-in closet. There was an envelope taped to the bottom, protected by clear tape, with handwriting she would recognize even in the dark. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, Laura considered asking them to keep it away, to keep it from being touched, to keep the renovations from disturbing anything that wasn't a wall. Instead, she approached, carefully peeled back the paper, ran her hand over her name as if caressing a memory, and walked to the empty room to sit on the floor, amidst dust and screws, and tear open the envelope with the delicacy she hadn't possessed in recent months. Inside, a sheaf of notarized documents, letterheads, stamps, dates, and, folded between the pages, a long, handwritten letter, with the curvy lines of someone who doesn't know how to mince words when it comes to feelings. She read the letter first, because it was the part that burned. The text began with the day he'd stopped by the notary, to give you what we've built with what has always been certain in me, and continued with a simple, almost banal confession, a gesture born not of guilt, but of commitment. The deed to the apartment was being transferred to her name, in its entirety, as a gift for a birthday that hadn't been what he'd dreamed. She said she hadn't told him about it at dinner so as not to turn the surprise into a patch, and that she'd kept there, in the place where the closet would cast a shadow, the proof of what she understood to be love, the house, the roof, the shelter, even when times change. Laura felt the ground give way under the weight of a truth that didn't match the last few days, and yet she silently explained every restrained gesture, every retreat, every care that offered no bargain. She returned to the papers with dust-stained hands, quietly reading the formal lines that stated, in notary language, that this address was now exclusively hers, dated before any collapse, as if time wanted to testify that the gift was conceived when there was still hope. The impact came like a gale. There was no one to discern for her the boundaries between gratitude and guilt, and so she stood there, motionless, the noise of the construction continuing on the other side of the wall as if the city were moving forward without asking permission. The clipboard fell to her side, the pens rolled, her eyes filled with tears, and Laura took a deep breath, trying not to be swept away by the current that called her name. When she stood, her body was heavy, and yet she walked steadily to the hallway, asked the builder's permission, and locked herself in the bathroom as if searching for a capsule of silence in the midst of a storm. She sat on the edge of the bathtub and reread the first sentence of the letter, repeating in a broken voice the gesture he had made alone, in secret, and which forever changed the narrative she had been forcing within herself to bear the weight of what she had chosen. It wasn't pity she felt, nor the childish desire to go back in time, it was the acute clarity of what is lost when one chooses without addressing the consequences. He washed his face, put the documents back in the envelope, and when he left, he asked for a break in the work. The work ceased like a large animal deciding to rest, and the apartment fell into a rarefied stillness, smelling of paint and regret. The phone weighed heavily in her hands before she could make any decision, but the urgency to avoid losing it in half-explanations made her dial. He answered with the serenity he had learned to cultivate, which at that moment stung like an unattainable virtue. Laura simply said she needed to see him, bluntly, and that it was about something important he had left behind, and he replied that he could meet her later, in a place of your choosing. He chose the apartment's balcony, now bare of furniture, a bare stage where words would have to stand without the usual cushions. When Daniel arrived, there was a chill in the air that seeped through the cracks and a silence that acknowledged everything that no longer needed to be said. He took off his coat, left it hanging on the makeshift doorknob, and faced her without harshness, as if offering the other the chance to speak first. Laura held out the envelope as if returning something she didn't know she deserved, and her voice came out thinly, but clearly. She needed to understand why, and when, and if he had really done it, thinking about what love should be and not what fear demands. Daniel held the envelope with the kindness of someone receiving a gift for the second time. He didn't need to open it to know what it was, and even so, he took out the folded letter, read 3 lines as if visiting a place he'd already been, and looked up. The answer came unadorned, just a clean truth. It was before, long before I realized what was happening. I wanted to give you what, for me, defines care. If life ever changed, you'd have a roof over your head, you'd have the place we made together, because I don't know how to love by measuring. Laura tried to say that it changed everything, that the gesture lit another map within her, but the words tangled in an urgency that found no outlet. She had to compose herself, lean against the cold wall, and then asked what weighed most heavily, the question burning between the documents and the letter, if he'd already known when he'd decided to remain silent, if he'd hidden the gift so that, in the end, it would become a lesson, if there had been calculation. Daniel shook his head with a quiet sadness, and said that he doesn't write letters to make a show, he writes to save what would be lost in speech, and that he kept quiet because anything he said would become currency, would become a weapon, and he didn't want that with their story. The conversation flowed like water between stones, sometimes fluid, sometimes intermittent. Laura, her voice wavering, confessed that, upon finding the envelope, she felt smaller than she had in a long time, that she felt ashamed of the version of herself that had walked away from it in such a hurry, and that now, touching the proof of such great care, a part of her was moving the pieces again, as if trying, albeit late, to recognize the territory from which she should never have left. Daniel listened without deviating, letting the words do the work of purifying the air, and, when she paused, he asked only that she not turn the gesture into a chain. He said, with gentle firmness, that he didn't want the apartment to become an altar of guilt, but rather that she make it a breathable, beautiful, fulfilling place, for herself. Laura asked, in an almost childlike whisper, if there was any possibility of reconnecting, if such a grand gesture didn't at least deserve the joint effort of seeing how far it would go. Daniel held her gaze and replied slowly, without leaving any edges, I forgive you, and that's the most love I have to give you right now. Forgiveness and peace. The rest is in another boat. There was a long silence, the wind seemed to join in, and Laura, her hands clutching the envelope to her chest, realized that the pain of the no, in that moment, wasn't punishment, it was consequence. Even so, she had to say that she was trying to rebuild things, that she'd ripped out baseboards, painted walls, changed light bulbs, but that nothing could remove his scent from the air, that vague scent of a loved one that never returns. Hearing, Daniel took a step closer, not so much to console her as to not leave her alone with the weight of his words, and carefully recounted what had until then been only hinted at in the gesture. On the day of the failed anniversary, before any shadows could be cast, he'd spent the morning at the notary's office, sorted everything out, and considered putting the deed in a box along with a simple note. He thought it would be poetic to give the house instead of flowers, and that the house, being hers, would be like a commitment to the future, even if that future insisted on shaking. And that night, faced with a distance he still didn't understand, he swallowed the urge to tell, kept the surprise and, in silence, stuck the envelope at the bottom of the closet because he thought that one day, when everything was lighter, they would find it together and laugh at the theatricality of the hiding place. Laura breathed like someone submerging after a long time. The image of him gluing the envelope, thinking of her smile, rose so vividly it cut like a blade. She had to sit on the makeshift wooden step, and for a few seconds she spoke with the raw honesty of someone who no longer has anywhere to hide. She said that her memory of that day was now different, that every gesture she had interpreted as inattention was, in fact, a wariness of the surprise, and that understanding this made her feel a regret that couldn't be contained in her chest. She wanted to ask why 1,000 times, wanted to say she would do anything to return to the time of the candle extinguished with a quick puff, but her newborn lucidity brooked no fantasies. Instead, she returned the words to where they came from and offered the only possible acknowledgement: she chose, and choices shape destinies. Daniel nodded, not with satisfaction, but with the maturity of someone who knows the power of a point one places in order to breathe. What I did was because I was you with me. There's nothing heroic about it. Just don't let it consume you. Let something else grow in its place, he said, and the sentence landed between them with the gentleness of a blanket draped over an exhausted body. When the topic turned to the next step, their voices changed in timbre, shifting from the warm tone of affection to the practicality of what needed to be fixed. Laura asked if he wanted anything back, a painting, a book, any material memento that might make the goodbye more symmetrical. He said he kept what was needed and that if something was missing one day, he would write, but that at that moment he just wanted her to make it a good place, that the renovation wouldn't be a permanent punishment, that the new walls wouldn't bear invisible inscriptions of debt. She promised she would try, that she would change the color of the curtains, that she would let the sunlight in earlier, and was moved by the image of herself studying paints, as if the act of painting were a ritual of reparation. Daniel smiled slightly, as if agreeing to a plan that no longer concerns him, and announced he was leaving. Laura held his arm for a second, not to prevent his departure, but to thank him for a kind of emotional education she would never forget. "Thank you for giving me a home when I was no longer a home," she said, and he replied only that she would know what to do with it. The farewell was short and long at the same time. They walked to the door and, there, without pretense, exchanged a hug that was almost a prayer, a mutual blessing that each would move forward without losing what they had learned. There was no kiss, no promise, no catchphrase. There was humanity, the kind that hurts and heals at the same time. Daniel grabbed his coat, walked down the stairs as if respecting the pace of his legs, got in the car, and stood for a few minutes with his hands on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on an invisible line ahead. He didn't cry there. He knew the water would come out later, somewhere else, when the lines of their conversation stopped echoing. Laura, for her part, went back into the apartment and stared at the hole in the closet as if staring at an open window to a past suddenly less dark. She closed her eyes, leaned her forehead against the cold wall, and allowed herself to cry, not to call back someone who was already gone, but to give her grief a proper place. When she opened her eyes again, she noticed a rectangle of light crossing the room. It was late afternoon and the dust in the air shone like a suspended universe. When the bricklayers returned from their break, she asked them to continue, but to be careful with the corner where the envelope had been, as if there were an invisible altar there that deserved respect. The sledgehammer resumed its rhythm, the paint was mixed, the walls were prepared for the new color she had yet to choose. In her coat pocket, the folded letter weighed like a smooth stone found in childhood and kept forever. Laura knew she would need time to learn how to enter that space without tripping over memories, and at the same time, she felt a sudden urge to plan a reading corner, a large plant in the living room, a bookshelf she had always wanted but had postponed. His gesture, now revealed, didn't change the reality of what had been broken, but it gave the reconstruction a texture she had never imagined. It wasn't about erasing what had been, it was about bearing the marks without allowing them to define the future. Dawn promised to arrive with sharp thoughts, and she accepted this intimate battle as part of the journey. Outside, Daniel drove without maps again, but now with the calm of someone leaving an old house and finally closing the right door. The memory of the encounter didn't bring euphoria, but a mature, clean serenity that, for the first time in a long time, wasn't mixed with the vertigo of suspicion. There were no more hanging questions, no excuses to fabricate. There was a possible straight line. There was also a shadow of tenderness for the past that wouldn't turn to dust because it wasn't made of lies, but of time lived. Night fell completely as he parked and stood watching the streetlights turning on one by one like discreet surveillance lights. The calm I felt wasn't cold, it was an honest shelter. And in the discreet corner of my chest, a place that had been empty for weeks began to be filled with a new light that didn't yet have a name, only a direction. Meanwhile, in the apartment under renovation, Laura hugged the envelope to her and, for the first time since she decided to start over by ripping out baseboards, understood that rebuilding would also mean living with what couldn't be translated into paint. The work continued, the rubble was cleared, the echo responding to each hammer blow like someone marking time to a song that suddenly demands the next verse. The night wore on like a tired animal as Laura watched the builders gather tools, disconnecting extension cords, leaving on the counter a plastic cup of coffee grounds and a handful of screws someone swore would be useful the next day. The apartment, now silent again, breathed like a chest that had just cried. Laura stood by the window for a while, not looking at the street, just mentally counting the things she needed to decide: the color of the living room wall, the position of the sofa, the fate of the old book still waiting for boxes, what to do with the letter weighing down her pocket like a warm body. Her phone vibrated with a short message from the friend with whom she sometimes shared shallow outbursts, "How was it?" without context. She responded with a "I'll tell you later," and realized that something in the way she thought of the answer was shifting, as if the need to narrate to others was losing strength in the face of the urgency to face what was only hers. She walked to the kitchen, cupped her hands in her hands and drank water straight from the tap, looked around for any distracting noise, and found only the sound of her own breathing. Then she decided she needed to get out of there, not to escape, but to take a break. She grabbed her coat, tucked the envelope into a thick book and put it in her bag, turned out the lights with almost ceremonial care, and went downstairs as if descending to face a city unaware of its earthquakes. Outside, the rain had turned to drizzle, and the air was lighter. Laura walked aimlessly for 2 blocks to a bakery where she had once been happy on afternoons that now belonged to an invisible album. She went in, chose a table against the wall, ordered a tea she didn't want, and fiddled with the tea bag without dipping it in the water, as if delaying the infusion were a way to hold off time. Then she noticed a shadow crossing the window, and after a second, she recognized the man with whom she had spent months of her life's breaks. He entered, didn't notice her immediately, ordered a coffee, and when he turned, he saw her. The shock lasted less than a blink, and the automatic smile came like a textbook resource for delicate situations. He approached, hesitated, and, probably believing he was too grown up to pretend he didn't know her, asked if he could sit down. Laura nodded an almost imperceptible yes, and the air between them grew tense like a taut rope. She anticipated the first sentence, perhaps to avoid giving him the chance to lead the meeting: "I found a gift that wasn't meant for today, and I realized too late the magnitude of what I dropped." The man took a deep breath, leaned his elbow on the table, and attempted a tone of voice that bordered on empathy, but there was caution in every syllable, that feeling of someone shielding themselves from responsibilities they no longer want to assume. "You asked, is everything okay?" with the lightness of someone asking a colleague in line, and Laura felt her patience shift within her. She didn't want to fight, she didn't want performative confessions, she simply wanted closure on something that had always existed on the edge of the abyss. She said, looking into his eyes, that this was no longer home, that what had begun as vertigo now felt hollow, and that the news she'd received that afternoon, the gesture tucked away in the closet, had thrown open a contrast impossible to bear. The man nodded, stirred his coffee with a spoon that touched the cup with an irritating noise, and tried a casual argument: "Life is complex, nobody belongs to anyone," phrases Laura had repeated to herself like a mantra when she needed to soothe her guilt. Only now they fell into the saucer without making sense. She leaned forward and, with a newly learned calm, said she would end it, not as punishment, but as a matter of precision. He responded with a "better this way," so ready it almost sounded rehearsed, and that hurt less than she'd imagined, because in that moment she no longer wanted him as anything, just as a closed chapter. But he still held out his hand, perhaps out of habit of someone who likes to have the last word, and asked her to understand that he too had a life, schedules, connections, glances that followed his steps. Laura realized that, for the first time, she wasn't envious of any place where she didn't fit in, and that the only life she would be responsible for from then on was her own. "I understand, and that's why I'm staying. You go yours, I'll go mine," he said in a clear voice. He managed a cordial smile, said, "Good luck," got up, left the money on the plate like someone finishing a work coffee, and left. Laura watched the door open and close, and when the glass stopped shaking, she dipped the tea bag into the water that had already cooled. The belated gesture, that of slowly tinting a heatless liquid, seemed curious as a metaphor for what was to come. The temperature would no longer be the same, but it was still possible to extract flavor from something. She finished her tea without rushing, paid, walked in the drizzle to her car, got in and stood for a few minutes with her hands on the steering wheel, feeling the presence of the envelope in her bag like a heartbeat. Across town, Daniel had also gone out to test the newfound silence he'd gained after the encounter. He took a book to a square, sat on a wooden bench beneath a tree shedding thin leaves, and opened it to the first page, not intending to read, just to inhabit a routine that had always served as shelter. He looked at the people passing by, at a couple arguing quietly about which way to go, at a boy trying to balance a ball with more will than coordination. He felt that the world, despite everything, doesn't move according to the scale of individual tragedies, and that perhaps there's a kind of mercy in that. When the phone vibrated, he recognized the name and answered, not because he needed to, but because it would be dishonest to his own delicacy to ignore it. On the other end, Laura said simply that she'd finished what needed to be finished, and that, if he wanted, he could collect some things that had been left in boxes, paintings that might make more sense to him. Daniel thought for a second, said he'd stop by sometime during the week, and that there was no need to rush, that the important thing was for everything to air out, without us. She thanked him, and they both sat in silence for a few seconds before hanging up, a silence that, for once, wasn't threatening, but restful. The following days unfolded under a new arrangement. Laura woke early, greeted the construction workers, made decisions like someone who wants to learn how to organize chaos with their own hands, and, in between, went out to pick up paint samples with names that made her laugh inside, imagining a cotton gray living room, a hallway the color of antique sand, a serene blue bedroom. In each store, she chose something small and portable, a lamp, a vase, a blanket, and surprised herself by realizing she was capable of loving things on her own. At night, she read the letter again, not as self-flagellation, but as if visiting a memory room to calibrate her compass, and then put it back in the same place, breathing before turning off the lamp. On the second weekend, she decided it was time to go through the boxes of his remaining belongings. She opened them carefully, as if the smells could escape, and found photographs, movie tickets, a keychain she'd always thought ugly, letters they'd exchanged at the beginning of it all. She tenderly separated what would make sense to return to him, and set aside a smaller box with things that, even his, told their story and would therefore remain. Touching a book with his notes in the margins, she read an underlined sentence about learning to move forward without losing who you are, and smiled with a bittersweetness, like someone who accepts a lesson without needing to paint it. On Tuesday, Daniel rang the intercom with the respect one feels for places where things have changed hands. He went upstairs and entered a still faceless apartment, smelling of putty and promises. Laura extended her hand, he responded, and they walked to the living room where the box of paintings awaited him. "I chose the one I think was most like you," she said, and he thanked her with the sincerity of someone who appreciates care. They stood before the main, empty wall, and for a moment they both imagined what the space would be like when finished, and the feeling wasn't of invasion, but of blessing. Laura took the opportunity to say she'd chosen light colors, that she wanted to breathe in light, and that she'd been going out on foot to see the streets with fresh eyes. Daniel said it was a good idea and, without realizing it, gave a route tip, a shortcut under trees that he liked to take in the late afternoon. The conversation continued for a few minutes, and in each sentence, a piece of normalcy returned. When he lifted the box, she offered to help, but he politely declined. Before walking to the door, he glanced at the hole that had been the closet, now covered and smooth. They didn't say anything, they didn't need to. She opened it, he stepped out, and the hallway seemed wider. At the farm, Laura faced something she'd been putting off, talking to her mother, her brother, and the friend who had kept her softer versions of what happened to herself. She chose the order carefully, first her mother, who always sees what's unsaid. They sat in the old kitchen with its stained tiles, and Laura recounted the events without embellishment, delivering the scenes as if delivering dishes to a ready table. Her mother listened, sometimes squeezing her hand, sometimes shaking her head in a gesture that mixed sorrow with tenderness, and finally said something that wasn't exactly consolation, but it was true. "Life isn't a bartering fair, daughter, but it's not a courtroom either. If you understand, you've learned, now it's time to cross over and care." Laura cried a little, not because of the scolding that didn't come, but because of the kindness that, somehow, held her more accountable than any accusation. Then she went to find her brother, who had no talent for half-heartedness. He listened to her with a frown, and when she finished, he asked if she was sure she had cut what needed to be cut. She said yes, and he, less harsh than expected, simply said that he hoped she wouldn't forget her own worth, and that if she needed it, he would help her carry boxes in silence. Daniel, in turn, realized that the conversation with Laura had opened up space within him. There was no euphoria, there was space. In the days that followed, he resumed simple lunches with people who had disappeared due to a lack of emotional time, accepted a friend's invitation to a game he didn't even enjoy that much, but where the shared laughter washed away a place where sadness had been molding. One afternoon, leaving the square where he sometimes read without reading, he let his mind follow a new path and entered a small bookstore, the kind that keeps handwritten letters of recommendation on paper attached to books with wooden clips. It was there that a prosaic conversation about old editions turned into a curious exchange about the best reading order of an author they both loved, and, before he knew it, he was laughing naturally with a stranger who shared an attention without urgency or ulterior motives. He didn't exchange phone numbers, didn't make any plans for later, didn't want to rush where calm had just been achieved. He left the bookstore surprised by the lightness of having conversations that didn't hide bombs under the table. He took a book, went to the square, and this time read 2 pages as if moving a limb that was numb and felt tingling. On Saturday, Laura decided she needed to face one last part of history with the man she'd abandoned. Not to relive it, but to draw a line that would prevent her from finding herself explaining benevolent versions of what had happened. She didn't call, didn't make an appointment, she got in her car and went to the bar where, days ago, she had been an accomplice to what she no longer wanted to name. She arrived early, sat at the bar, ordered a sparkling water, and observed the neon lights, trying to be cheerful before the time. She didn't wait long, he came in, greeted the bartender by name, recognized Laura, and his expression betrayed a silent question. She waved lightly and beckoned him with her hand. He approached, and she, with a serenity new to her, said she had come to say one last thing. "Don't worry, I won't hold you to promises you didn't make, nor blame you for what was my choice. I just want to tell you that it's over, for me, down to the last thread. I won't be the person waiting outside your clock," she said, firming each word like someone nailing wood. He tried to say, "No need to exaggerate," but she didn't give in to the provocation. "It's not exaggeration, it's care. I owe it to myself." The man, who always seemed comfortable anywhere, shifted on the bench as if unable to find his place, and Laura understood the conversation was over. She got up, paid for her water, left, and the night, without fireworks, seemed to embrace her. That same evening, Daniel, invited by a couple of friends for an unprovoked dinner, showed up with a cheap wine and a loaf of bread that had proven successful in a morning test. The 3 of them sat, chatting about trivialities, and at some point the topic veered into a realm everyone knew he'd been avoiding. There were no intrusive questions, just openness. He shared the essentials, without turning the conversation into a courtroom, and said there was one thing he was particularly grateful for, having managed to say no in time, without shouting. His friend, with teary eyes, said that this was strength and also love, and that one rarely realizes the extent of one when one is trying to measure the other. His friend, less given to metaphors, poured more wine and asked what he had planned for Sunday. Daniel said he would take an early walk, stop by a market, maybe cook something that smelled like home. They smiled, and the rest of the evening passed smoothly, as if the plates, tablecloth, and cutlery had agreed to be the setting for a restart. Sunday dawned with a brighter sun, and Laura, for the first time in weeks, opened all the windows, let the light in without asking permission, turned on some soft music, and began cleaning the dust that had accumulated in the cracks during the construction. It wasn't a penance ritual, it was a baptism. Between one cloth and another, she assembled the bookshelf, chose the height of each shelf, placed his books, hers, alternately, as if recognizing that their shared history doesn't fade, only finds new addresses. She hung a light painting, positioned the rug, tested the position of the sofa, and when she was tired, she sat on the floor and looked at the living room as if looking at a beloved face that had been ill and is now recovering. She picked up the letter, reread a passage about shelter, and decided the envelope wouldn't be hidden. I would frame the first page of the text, unsigned, undated, and place it in a discreet corner, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that, amid the ruins, there were bricks that weren't fake. In the afternoon, Daniel walked along the tree-lined route he had mentioned without thinking, and when he turned the corner, he unexpectedly encountered the same woman from the bookstore carrying a bag of oranges that threatened to tear. He approached, offered help, and she accepted with a short, frank laugh. They walked together for 2 blocks, chatting about the market, about a vendor who always gave an extra orange to everyone's purchases, about a dog that insisted on lying down in the middle of the path. There was no flirting, only kindness. When they reached the corner where their paths diverged, he said he lived nearby, offered to carry her to the door, she said she was close, that she would turn around, and thanked him. Before moving on, she mentioned a book club that met on Saturday afternoons at a small cafe, inviting her without insisting, leaving it hanging in the air like someone leaving an invitation on a wooden table. Daniel waved, followed, and realized that his heart, without fuss, had learned a new beat. It wasn't time for anything yet, it was just a good omen, and that was enough. As night fell, 2 windows in the same neighborhood lit up at different times. In one, Laura leaned over the new kitchen, opened a simple wine, prepared pasta with a shamelessly improvised sauce, and ate slowly, feeling the house accept the flavor. In the other, Daniel leafed through the book, underlined a passage about lingering on what matters, and wrote in the margin, for the first time in weeks, a note that had no address of pain. The world outside, indifferent and welcoming, continued to turn at its own pace. And the story, which for so long had been told as if it were made of absences, gained, that night, a new space to move, preparing the ground so that, finally, what needed to flow would find its way without violence, only with the precise gravity of the things that need to be said and done so that the rest of life can finally begin to be lived. The days began to fall into a different rhythm, as if the house, now clean and brighter, had imposed a different rhythm on each person's heart. Laura woke before the sun, fussed with the newly purchased plants, jotted down the renovation expenses in a notebook, and, between tasks, glanced at the discreet picture with the framed excerpt from the letter, not to blame herself, but to adjust her direction when her mind threatened to make excuses. Time, often the enemy of those who want to quickly rid themselves of pain, became the ally of a personal reorganization in which small gestures replaced grandiose promises. She cooked for herself, opened all the windows, turned up the music as loud as possible, and discovered that the clatter of silverware had a different meaning when no one expected her return. At night, when she laid her head on the pillow, she didn't apologize to the void, but asked for the courage to inhabit what was left. One afternoon, she decided to visit the neighborhood thrift store to buy an antique armchair that matched the new bookcase. He sat down, experienced the sensation of belonging to his own body, closed his eyes for a few seconds, and realized he had stopped rehearsing dialogues that would never happen. When they signed the delivery, his fingers didn't tremble. It was as if a part of him finally accepted that rebuilding isn't about redoing what was, but accepting that the form has changed. Daniel, on the other hand, taught his hands to live without squeezing the absent. He returned to the habit of cooking on nights when work didn't take away his hunger, chose ingredients with a care he'd previously reserved for the weekend, unpacked books, and lined up stories in a diary he wouldn't show anyone. On Saturday, he summoned the courage and showed up at the book club the woman at the bookstore had recommended. The cafe was small, the tables wooden, marked by antique mugs, the light yellow and warm. There were 8 people, and Sophia was among them, with an open notebook and a pencil tucked behind her ear. When they saw him arriving, someone unceremoniously pointed to an empty chair, and the circle began. The discussions weren't about who was right, but about the paths of sentences and what they ignited in each person, and Daniel felt his own voice slowly returning, at first timid, then firm, when he commented on a passage in which the protagonist was slow to close a door for fear of the silence in the hallway. Sophia listened attentively, without interrupting, and responded with a question that opened 3 more. At the end of the meeting, she smiled unhurriedly and said she liked the way he let his words breathe, and he replied, surprised by her sincerity that betrayed no ulterior motives, that it had been good to feel that a text could still generate positive disturbances. They walked out onto the sidewalk together, talked about cafes that closed too early and films worth watching slowly, and said goodbye with a "see you Saturday" that wasn't a promise, but a wish. In the week that followed, Laura faced a kind of heartache that often aches in other muscles, the feeling of responsibility for one's own name. She decided to call two mutual friends, those who had drifted apart when the story quietly broke, not to convince them of anything, but to ask them to stop blaming Daniel for choices that were his own. The tone was calm, the content direct. "I was wrong, there's no mitigating circumstance that absolves me, there's no narrative in which he appears guilty." He silently heard an apology coming from a friendly voice that, out of embarrassment, had chosen the most comfortable version for itself and now acknowledged its deviation. As she hung up, Laura felt her body lose a bit of weight, not because she was regaining allies, but because she was replacing the pieces on the board of her own conscience. Then she called a painter to paint the bedroom that had always been last in the couple's plans, a space that had no defined function and that now, little by little, was becoming a reading retreat, with a light carpet and curtains that cradled the breeze. As she hung a lamp, she considered what to do with the apartment long-term, not as an escape, but as an ethical gesture. It was hers, yes. But how to deal with something given out of love when that love no longer resides there, and at the same time understand that refusing it wouldn't rewrite anything that had been? The dilemma deepened when a purchase offer appeared by chance, brokered by a familiar real estate agent. The price was high, enough to allow her to start from scratch elsewhere, or pay off small debts and still have room to study something she'd been putting off for years. She spent an entire night sitting on the living room floor, staring at the freshly painted wall and weighing affection and responsibility on an invisible scale. Selling meant letting go of a house that was no longer a home and, in a way, returning to the world a possession she'd earned in a gesture that demanded no return. Keeping it meant honoring a gift that had been intended as shelter, giving new meaning to every door, every window. There was no clean solution. In the morning, she picked up her cell phone, wrote to Daniel carefully, and asked to talk, this time in a square, on the bench where he liked to read. When they met, she didn't dwell on preambles. She said there was a proposal, which she was tempted to accept to cut the threads that kept her tied to what she already knew didn't exist, but that she feared turning into currency what he had given without expectation. "I can refuse and stay here, but I don't know if that's loyalty to the gesture or fear of facing another life," she said, her voice soft yet firm. Daniel listened in silence, took the question in, and responded with a serenity that came from a newly constructed place, that the gift wasn't a debt, that she didn't owe him her permanence in any wall, and that if selling was the way to turn the page, he wouldn't object, wouldn't demand anything, wouldn't demand moral correction. "I only ask one thing of you, that the choice not be to please me or to punish me. That it be truly yours," she concluded, and the request fell like a simple compass on the complicated map. The conversation progressed through the shade of the trees and found an unexpected point of friction. Laura asked if she could tell her closest circle that the gesture had existed, that the house had been a gift, so they would stop weaving distorted legends at dinners and messages. "I don't want to portray you as a saint on a mural, but I also won't accept being painted as something you weren't," she said, biting back her own haste. Daniel spent a few seconds watching the people passing by with bags and dogs, choosing words that wouldn't hijack her right to construct her own version. He said there was no need to hide, that the truth was solid enough to stand on its own, but that if it were to become a flag, he preferred it to remain silent. Her privacy wasn't a whim, it was part of the healing. "If telling helps you put things right, tell them. Just don't turn it into a banner, because I don't want my gesture to become a parade outfit," he concluded mildly. Laura nodded, thanked him for his thoughtfulness, and right there, under a midday sun that had no patience for drama, she realized the dilemma had no clear answer. Either path implied a loss. By choosing, she would also lose. And yet, she chose. She would call the brokerage, accept the offer, allocate part of the amount to a study fund and the rest to something meaningful for the community, not to compensate, but to prevent the money from becoming a new ghost. Late in the afternoon, Daniel met Sophia at the door of the book club cafe. She was carrying a different book than the one they were supposed to discuss, and joked that it was literary infidelity. They laughed, went in, sat side by side, and dove into the group's conversation like someone jumping into water whose temperature they already know. The topic revolved around characters trying to redeem themselves while insisting on revisiting the crime scene, and when the word fell into his lap, Daniel spoke about the difference between repairing and reopening, about the risk of confusing confession with spectacle. Sophia listened to him with unpressuring attention, and on the way out, walking to the corner, she commented that she liked how he drew boundaries without erecting them like walls. He smiled with a smile he hadn't used in a while and ventured a simple invitation: coffee the next day, in a bright place, without shadow tricks. She accepted, but added a caveat: if it's difficult, we'll reschedule. I know what it's like to adjust after a fall. Daniel thanked him without needing to explain, and when he got home, he noticed that his chest was reacting, not with fireworks, but with a discreet candle lit on a set table. On the morning of the meeting, he arrived 5 minutes early and chose a table in the gentle sun. Sophia arrived in a plain dress and an unhurried smile, sat down, ordered a cinnamon coffee, and the conversation settled into the very space where two adults who have already been hurt choose to rest. He explained, with few details and great honesty, that he came from a history in which trust had forgotten how to function and that he preferred to err on the side of too much clarity than to hurt on the side of too little. She responded with a light-hearted account of a long-standing relationship that had ended due to the wear and tear of small lies that had become a habit, and they wished each other lessons that didn't require pain. I don't collect versions, I collect books and good silences, she said with a laugh, and Daniel realized he liked that direct way of saying things, without pedantry, without fear of appearing vulnerable. They left the cafe with the naturalness of someone not trying to follow a script, and as they walked down the sidewalk, a flower vendor approached them with a clumsy bouquet. Sophia politely declined, commenting that she preferred potted plants because they require constant care. Daniel kept the comment without romanticizing it, but feeling that it contained a useful lesson. Meanwhile, Laura handled the sale of the apartment with surprising efficiency. She negotiated without theatrics, signed papers without pushing the future, faced the melancholy that trickled through her fingers as she sorted through the last of her belongings, and called a neighborhood social project that welcomed women who, like her, needed to start over, inside and out. She offered a donation of part of the amount on the condition that her name not be published. She didn't want publicity, she wanted coherence. The coordinator on the other end of the line asked if she would share what she had learned in a conversation circle. Laura hesitated for a moment, not out of embarrassment, but out of fear of turning her pain into a spectacle, then she said she would, assured of a protected environment. That day, she sat with 8 other women on plastic chairs lined up in a simple, airy room, and spoke without embellishment, accepting her guilt without fraying her own humanity. At one point, someone asked if she forgave herself. Laura didn't answer right away. She took a deep breath and said she was learning not to hurt herself, and that perhaps forgiveness, if it came, would be a consequence of a life lived with different standards. As she left, she felt the air become lighter. It wasn't absolution, it was work. The dilemma took on a second layer when the real estate agent set a key delivery date, and the new owner asked to talk to her about keeping a living room wall the same color, because she liked the hue and the light. It seemed trivial, but Laura was overcome by the idea of giving away a fond memory to someone else in a place where she'd been both happy and unhappy. She smiled, agreed, and left with the feeling that the world sometimes offers us small healings through simple questions. At home, she packed a box with Daniel's remaining belongings, gathered the keychain she'd once thought ugly, the book with the notes he'd wanted back, and wrote a short, unsigned note saying, "This goes back to whoever it belongs to." On the appointed day, she delivered the box to the concierge of the building where he lived, and, as she walked back to her car, she wept silently, without dramatizing the street, simply allowing her face to convey the rite of passage. On Daniel's side, Sunday ended with a short message from Sophia, a photo of an underlined passage that spoke about kindness as a form of courage. He responded with another image, this time of a recipe open on the counter, and wrote that he would risk the dish that night. Sophia sent an awkward emoticon and said that if it turned out badly, he should give the disaster a nice name because that way, painful things sometimes deceive and get better. They laughed. It was not enough, it was enough. Turning off the screen, Daniel realized that on the table was the box he had received that morning with his old things. He opened it slowly, took out the keychain, and put it in the drawer, not as a symbol of anything, just as an object with a history. He picked up the book, recognized his own handwriting in the margins, and rested his fingers on a comment he had written years before about the danger of becoming a collector of ruins. He smiled, this time genuinely, like someone surprised by advice from the past, and understood that he was, finally, standing on ground that wouldn't sink. The eve of Laura's move brought a request that crossed delicate lines. She wrote to Daniel carefully, asking if he would be comfortable signing a simple, one-line letter declaring that the decision to sell was entirely his, that he wasn't losing anything, and that he was at peace, simply so that family members who insisted on fabricating stories wouldn't drain his energy in the coming months. "I understand if you prefer not to," she added, already bracing himself for a denial he would respect. Daniel read it, felt the weight of the potential exposure, and thought about Sophia, thought about his own future, considered the line between being kind and giving up. He responded late in the afternoon with a different proposal, that he would write a direct email to the family members who were contacting him, without revealing details, simply stating that it was her decision and that he supported her right to organize her own life. "I won't feed the wheels, but I won't leave you alone in a narrative that isn't fair," he wrote. Laura thanked him with a swiftness that betrayed relief, and for the first time since everything had silently exploded, she felt treated like an adult and, at the same time, supported in the right way. The following night, Sophia and Daniel sat on a stone bench by a lake, with no agenda or urgency. They talked about trips they hadn't taken, about their favorite childhood foods, about how difficult and beautiful it is to learn not to sacrifice one's peace in the name of proving love. Sophia said she told herself, on the most difficult mornings, that life is a sequence of imperfect choices made with the best one has, and that, therefore, there was no room for heroes, only for people who try. Daniel said that, for a long time, he had confused the ability to endure with proof of love, and that now he preferred to slowly build something where both sides wanted the bridge. The wind blew lightly, a dog ran in a funny zigzag, and for a moment the two were silent, not as if they had nothing to say, but as if they knew that sometimes the best part of a conversation is the break. When the keys changed hands the next day, Laura would take one last box, lock the door unceremoniously, hand the bundle to the new owner, and walk to her car, feeling in her steps the weight and lightness of what she had chosen. She had packed a suitcase with clothes, books, and the comic strip with the excerpt from the letter, which would now travel with her to another address, not as a ghost, but as a witness to a chapter she preferred to remember for what it taught rather than what it destroyed. As she started the engine, she would think of the women's circle, her mother's words, the square where she heard that true choice doesn't consult an audience. That night, she would write a letter she wouldn't send to anyone, telling herself that mistakes don't disappear, but transform when they become a reason to change the way we walk. Daniel, in another part of the city, would close the book early, leave a message for Sophia arranging the next club meeting, and prepare a basket for the Sunday market, mindful of a ritual that now tied the beginning of her weeks. And the story, which until now had been dust and paper, would lean entirely towards an outcome where each one, on separate paths, would need to prove with their own hands that true love is not what holds you by force, it is what allows you to go without knocking the other down, while an old gesture, hidden in the back of a closet, continued silently illuminating the next choice. The morning of the key handover dawned with a timid light, the kind that seems to be asking permission to enter, and Laura walked through the last rooms like someone saying goodbye to a relative leaving, without delay, without a word. The new owner arrived with a proper smile, a clipboard, and an enthusiasm that didn't ask for permission. She complimented the color of the wall, admired the brightness of the balcony, asked about the quiet neighbor at 804, and Laura responded with dry politeness, keeping to herself the memories that couldn't fit into blueprints and measurements. At the end of the inspection, she handed over the keys without trembling and heard a, "Thank you, you took good care of this," like a small stamp on an envelope that already had an address. She went downstairs with her rolling suitcase clacking with a strange rhythm, closed the gate, and breathed in a different air, not because it was lighter, but because it no longer smelled like before. In the car, he called his mother and told her it was done. On the other side, A short pause preceded a, "That's great, daughter, now make the new place a space that speaks to who you want to be," and Laura replied that she would try, without promising. The new apartment was smaller, almost a mosaic of rooms, but it had a generous window that poured light into the living room during the afternoon. Her first night there was silent, and she decided she wouldn't miss a tenant. She unhurriedly opened boxes, chose a spot for the thrift store armchair, set up the bookshelf with alternating books, and, in the last niche, placed the comic strip with the excerpt from the letter, discreet, and signed, as if knowing that memory should fit into life, not the other way around. She cooked something simple, sat on the floor with the plate on her lap, and when the hours slowed down, she wrote a page in the notebook she'd insisted on keeping clean years ago. "Today I close one door and choose not to prop up another with my body," she scribbled, and was surprised by the firmness of her own handwriting. Before going to sleep, she placed a book she'd been putting off at the head of the bed, and as she turned out the light, she whispered that she was ready to endure the silence without anesthesia. That same night, Daniel walked through the market with a straw basket and a new calm on his shoulders. He ran into Sophia by chance among trays of tomatoes, and the encounter was so simple it seemed arranged by someone who knows the right timing. She held a bunch of basil and joked that it was her favorite form of hope because it perfumes her hands. He laughed and replied that hope with a scent is a better recipe. They walked side by side, bargained with a vendor who insisted on lettuce, and ended up sitting on a short bench with 2 pies on his napkin. They talked about the book club, about a film that seemed too long for what it contained, and when the conversation touched deeper waters, Sophia delicately changed her tone. "You said you prefer clarity to pen, so I say the same. I'm not in a hurry, but I'm not idling either," she said, looking at him with firm sweetness. Daniel nodded, returning the measure. "I'm learning to like the horizon without running towards it, but the horizon interests me," she replied, and her smile sparked an agreement that required no seals. 2 weeks later, an invitation arrived simultaneously, a birthday dinner for a mutual friend, the kind that brings together stories that, for so long, have intertwined like threads in the same loom. Laura read the message and felt her body attempt to recoil, then put the phone down and asked herself if avoiding it was caution or fear. She had promised not to hide. She replied, "I'll go," without explanation. Daniel received the same invitation sitting at the book club's coffee table, and Sophia, beside him, read it over his shoulder, recognized the name, and asked, with open curiosity, where he stood in that circle. "Old friends, many have stayed by my side, some have disappeared, and I don't blame them for any of this," he said, and she considered calmly. "I can go with you, I can skip it, I can meet you later, I can stay home waiting for you with a questionable dessert. Just tell me what makes you feel most whole." Daniel smiled with a relief that seemed to relax his muscles. "Come with me, if that's comfortable for you. I don't want to hide the life I'm trying to live, but I also don't want to make your presence a manifesto. I just want to go and come back safely." Sophia squeezed his hand on the table and replied, "Then we'll go and come back safely." The night of the dinner was filled with the smell of good food and the clatter of silverware. Laura chose a simple dress, a discreet earring, and a lipstick that didn't scream, and upon arriving, she was greeted by hugs that didn't seem rehearsed, just careful. She talked about work, books, a play they'd recommended, and at no point did she feel like she was on trial. When Daniel entered with Sophia, the room didn't spin, no one held their breath, but a brief wave of attention swept across the room, as is natural when important people arrive at the same tables with new stories to tell. Laura and Daniel's eyes met for a moment that felt like months, and then a small nod was enough. She acknowledged Sophia's presence with honest recognition. There was a whole woman there, unposed, looking at the world without guilt. During a pause in the music, Laura picked up 2 glasses, took a breath, and approached them both. "Good evening," he said in a clear voice, and addressing Sophia, he added, "I hadn't had the chance yet, but I want to thank you for taking care of him. That matters." Sophia, who hadn't expected any gesture, replied, "We thank each other for existing at the right time, right?" And Daniel, in the midst of that brief and rare exchange, looked at them both with his eyes, without interfering in what didn't need mediation. Laura raised her glass, lightly touched the rim, and walked away, as if fulfilling a right no one asked for but which her heart demanded. As the evening progressed, conversations formed in small circles exchanging memories and survival recipes. An old friend brought a seemingly harmless question to the table, but one that carried a trap: if you could go back, what would you change? Laura stared at him for a second and, before the question turned into cheap philosophy, answered without embellishment. I would change the way I look in the mirror. Not to like myself more, but to avoid buying excuses at a bargain price, and let out a brief laugh that disarmed any interpretation of pity. Daniel heard the answer from afar, not as someone monitoring, but as someone recognizing a newly learned language. Sophia, sensing the subtlety of that crossing, commented quietly, sometimes the most beautiful gesture is to let go of the boat and let it find its own harbor, and he, with a look that spoke truths without the need for long sentences, agreed. On the way out, serendipity preserved the delicacy the three had been trying to build. Laura waited for a ride-hailing service, and as she watched the headlight streak across the street, she felt a cheerfulness that was free of anxiety. Daniel and Sophia arrived at the sidewalk with coats draped over their shoulders, and for a moment they all stood under the same awning. The light rain caught a ride on the wind, bringing a chill of new beginnings. Laura looked at them both and simply said, "Good night," and Daniel replied, "Good night," without any attachments. Sophia, with the same tone, said goodbye, and when Laura's car stopped, she got in unhurriedly, closed the door, and gazed at the city through a glass that was no longer so distorting. On the way, she thought about the social project's conversation circle, the armchair waiting for her with its new blanket, the soup recipe she wanted to try. At home, she prepared hot water, chopped vegetables, put on some background music, and, alone, experienced a flavor that was neither penance nor reward, but simply life. The next day, chance again offered its ally. Daniel and Sophia decided to visit an off-the-beaten-path art fair, a spacious warehouse with paintings, photographs, and small ceramic works. They walked between booths, chatting leisurely, and stopped in front of a series of black-and-white photographs of open windows, each revealing a fragment of life: a cat, a plant, a set table, a hand waving from afar. Sophia pointed to an image in which a window framed a clothesline with sheets and said, "I like what's hidden too, the breeze, the smell of clean fabric, the conversation we don't hear," and Daniel replied that that was how he wanted to continue, leaving what doesn't need to be hidden. In a corner of the warehouse, a table invited children to paint with their hands, and he watched a concentrated boy seriously pouring paint. Sophia noticed the look, approached, and, smiling, whispered something that was desire, not pressure. "I don't know what future we can draw, but I know I like seeing you looking at this scene like someone who has already learned that care is a verb that can be conjugated," and Daniel just rested his hand on hers for a second, like someone underlining without coloring. That same Sunday, Laura decided it was time for a difficult conversation with someone who still saw her as the same old version of herself, a close cousin who had avoided her since the separation. They met in a simple square, shared an unpretentious coffee, and, after pleasantries, got to the important topic. "I didn't come to ask for absolution, I came to tell you that I'm living a different life. You can be angry with me for what I did, and that's fair, but I won't accept being reduced to this forever," she said, with a transparency that disarmed the other woman. Her cousin looked at the ground, fiddled with her plastic cup, and explained that her anger had less to do with moral judgment and more to do with the fear that she wouldn't face the mirror. "I love you. And I was afraid you'd escape from yourself," she confessed, with the sincerity of someone who doesn't know how to mask affection. Laura nodded, thanked her for listening to that without hesitation, and proposed a new pact: "If you ever see me straying again, you'll bring me back with hurtful questions, okay?" The two laughed, and the light rain that was beginning to fall didn't break the agreement. Midweek, an unexpected message arrived on Laura's phone. It was from the man she'd cut ties with, a short text asking for a half-hour coffee date, no drama, just to sort things out. Laura stared at the screen for a few minutes and realized the invitation was a test of the kind of person she now wanted to be. She didn't respond right away, calling the social project coordinator and asking for a quick chat. They sat on two plastic chairs, and Laura, like someone checking her locks before a trip, posed the question. Do I accept, do I not accept? Do I need to prove to myself that I can say no without having to see him? The woman, whose eyes held an understanding unbeknownst to books, calmly responded. What are you looking for in this meeting? If you're trying to resolve the past, it won't resolve itself in half an hour. If you're trying to prove to yourself that you've changed, you don't need his presence for that. If it's out of curiosity, be careful, curiosity can also bridge old abysses. Laura, listening, realized there was nothing there but a rope pulling back, and typed the response that sought her own dignity. I'm not going. I don't need to. It's over. She sent it and felt a quiet noise inside her, like an internal door that had finally been locked on the right side. On Friday, Daniel received an email from one of Laura's family members, a short, respectful message thanking him for clarifying that the decision to sell was hers, that no one should take sides, that everyone should, ultimately, mind their own business. He read it with a relief that was silent, deleted it from his inbox, and shut down the computer early, allowing himself to stop by the market and buy ingredients for a dinner that didn't need to impress anyone. At the table, with the food ready, he set 2 plates. Sophia arrived with an unpretentious wine and a funny story about an elevator that stopped between floors, and the two laughed in a way that wasn't euphoric, but wholehearted. At one point in the evening, she became slightly serious and said, I'm glad you were able to close things calmly. Not everyone has that luxury. He agreed, adding, it wasn't a luxury, it was a persistent choice, and they toasted, not to the past, but to the care taken not to let it rule the roost. As the weekend drew to a close, Laura organized a small gathering at home with the women in the circle. She brought bread, fruit, and a cake that had turned out poorly and was therefore better, and suggested that each woman leave a sentence in a basket summarizing what she was learning. When her turn came, she said, I learned that love owes me nothing, I am the one who owes me fidelity to what I say I believe, and the phrase circulated around the room without needing translation. As she finished, she picked up the picture frame with the excerpt from the letter and shared, not its origin, but the meaning it now held. This reminds me of 2 things, that someone loved me as if they knew how, and that this doesn't justify my wrong choices. Both truths fit within the same frame. The women nodded, and the gathering dispersed unhurriedly, with hugs that didn't promise eternity, just presence. That night, Daniel walked with Sophia to a bridge that cut the city into 2 lines of light, and, leaning against the railing, they watched the reflections of the buildings as if watching a silent film. I've been thinking of time as a river that doesn't go in reverse, she said, and he replied, I've been thinking that if we learn to swim, the current doesn't scare us so much. There was a quiet pause, and Sophia, with a gesture of someone familiar with the shores, asked if he thought it would be worth visiting a distant beach in the coming weeks. Daniel, surprised by his own availability, said yes, but that he would prefer to book a room with 2 windows, so the light knows where to enter if one decides to fail. She laughed and agreed, and it was in that laughter that they both realized their bodies were already resting in a place where the past didn't empty the present. When they said goodbye, the city seemed to arrange the streetlights like a score of yellowed notes. On her way home, Laura crossed the street with a bag and, for a second, seemed to see, in a store window, the life she once wanted to buy in installments. She smiled at her reflection and continued on, reminding herself that what truly matters doesn't accept a consortium. Entering the apartment, she left her keys on the ceramic plate on the dresser, turned on the lamp, and opened a new notebook. She wrote slowly, as if measuring each word with her body. I won't romanticize the mistake. I will learn from it. If one day love returns through another door, it will find someone more whole, not more perfect. She closed the notebook and drifted off to sleep with the relief of someone who finally understands that the most worthy choices have no audience, but consequences. And, in the background, almost audible, the story breathed, asking for space for the final step, the one in which life, after saying so many goodbyes, prepares to say a yes that doesn't hurt anyone. Months later, when summer seemed to have settled gently into the clear afternoons, Laura arrived at the social projects warehouse with a bag of bread and a subtle nervousness filling her shoulders. In the lobby, a fabric-covered panel awaited the inauguration of the new reading space, the result of donations and the labor of people who learned to cultivate the ground they walk on. The coordinator welcomed her with a light hug, saying the room was beautiful, that the light paint and tall windows would accommodate stories and silences, and that there was one detail that might move her. Laura smiled cautiously, tucked her hair behind her ear, and preferred to save any expectations for later. Gradually, women and children arrived, some men too, neighbors who arrived with gentle curiosity. As the clock approached the hour, Daniel entered with Sophia, discreetly, invited by a mutual friend who supported the project. He walked down the hallway with the respect of someone who knows that in certain places you speak softly so as not to scare away courage, and Sophia, attentive to the walls, held his arm for a second, as if silently saying she was happy to be there by his side. Daniel's eyes met Laura's for a brief moment, enough for a sincere nod from someone who recognizes in the other a piece of their own past without falling into the abyss. When the fabric fell and the room's name appeared, the air seemed to catch its breath, shelter room. Below, a simple, unsigned, hand-painted phrase, the house, the roof, the shelter. Daniel read slowly, as if his body needed to catch up with what his eye already knew, and felt the world align a memory with the present without asking permission. Sophia noticed the silent start, leaned close to his ear, and asked softly if everything was okay, and he nodded with a gratitude that needed no explanation. Laura, on the other side, kept her eyes on the wall for a lifetime, and when the coordinator called her to say a few words, she walked with a calm she had built with hard work. She didn't mention names, didn't build a heroic mural, didn't ask for absolution. She said that space existed because many hands decided that no one should go through the night without a symbolic roof, that books and chairs and light are also forms of home, and that, one day, she learned the hard way that love isn't currency, it's sustenance. I come here because I want to learn to use my hands to build, not to push wrong doors, he said, and the silence that followed wasn't surprising, it was respect. Amid the applause, Daniel felt his skin crawl, not from longing, but from the recognition that certain pains only find meaning when they become a haven for more people than just us. After the inauguration, people swarmed through the new room. Children took turns perching on colorful beanbags, a woman ran her fingers through books as if greeting old friends, and a boy pointed to the phrase on the wall and asked his mother what shelter meant. The mother responded with a simple example, it's when we enter and feel safe, and the boy nodded as if saving a word for another day. Laura circulated, offering coffee, thanking them for coming, and during a break, stopped before Daniel and Sophia with a smile that asked for nothing. Thank you for coming, she said, and Sophia gently replied that the room seemed to have been made by hands that knew where it hurt, and that this made it more beautiful. Daniel, glancing at the wall bearing his words from another time, added without theatricality that he was happy to see a phrase born from a complicated gesture become a window for others. Laura understood the whole message, the one that didn't need to come out in full, and simply nodded before being called by a child who wanted help reaching a high book. Life sometimes has the decency to orchestrate the details. In the following days, new layers of closure were laid over the hours like someone carefully covering a bed. Daniel and Sophia planned a short trip to the coast in the off-season, a promise of empty sand and a leisurely sea. He bought 2 tickets without fanfare, booked a simple inn with balconies that basked in the sun without asking permission, and, the day before their departure, stood at the front door with a keychain in his hand. It wasn't a request, it was a symbol. I know time has its paces, and I respect each one, but I'd like you to know that this is a door you can open with your own hands, whenever and if you want, he said, handing over the copy. Sophia listened with all her might, took the key, attached it to her keychain, and responded with the kind of courage that doesn't wave a flag. I don't want to live yet, I want to come and leave with you knowing that I'm coming back because I want to, not because I have to. And I want to walk through that door, and they both smiled with an agreement that didn't require letterhead. On the beach, they waded with their feet in the cool water, laughed at small, silly things, talked about the club's current book, and one late afternoon, leaning against a rock, they shared a silence that was worth more than several hasty declarations. Daniel understood that this was the highest form of peace he had ever known, a peace that didn't need to assert itself against anything, simply offered itself solidly. Laura, for her part, took a path she long thought she couldn't handle. She enrolled in a writing course in the same warehouse as the project, not to turn pain into income, but to learn to master words responsibly. In the first class, her fingers trembled before a blank page, and instead of stopping, she began with the sentence that had weighed most heavily on her mind: "I left myself and came back on foot." The professor, a man with a thin beard and a gentle humor, said this was a legitimate beginning, and that sometimes the best paragraph is the one that appears unapologetically. At the end of the module, there was a public reading. Laura walked up to the small makeshift stage with steady legs and read a short text in which a woman sold the house where she learned to love to build a place where others could learn to stay. When she finished, someone at the back of the room said, "Thank you," and there was no one to thank but life. On her way out, a young woman caught up with her and asked if she'd be willing to lead a bi-weekly workshop with other women to ensure stories don't become a stumbling block. Laura considered her schedule, her energy, her fear, and said yes, this time without a list of reservations. Chance, that artisan who appears when no one calls, offered Laura a closure she hadn't asked for. One Saturday, as she crossed the square with a bag of vegetables, she saw the man she'd shared the detour with pushing a baby stroller alongside a smiling woman. Her first impulse was to detour 2 blocks, then her old curiosity tried to hold her ground, and finally, the new choice prevailed with elegance. She stayed the course, passed them at a safe distance, and at the exact moment he recognized her, she lifted her chin with a dignity that doesn't challenge, only affirms, and passed. There was no wave, no ready-made phrase. As she walked away, the feeling of shock came not from the reunion itself, but from the discovery that it didn't hurt. Her heart didn't race, her hands didn't tremble. Just a discreet realization: the past had finally approved its own death certificate. On the bench at home, she wrote in her notebook, "My body responded before my pride, I am free," and closed it without initials. At the book club, Daniel read aloud a passage in which a character chose to forego heroism to care for the essential, and the circle fell silent for seconds that felt ritualistic. Sophia, smiling with her eyes, commented that she liked how he found the center of the sentences without going beyond them, and, on the way out, at the curb, he said he had something to ask. It wasn't a marriage proposal, it wasn't a promise of forever, it was an adult invitation to a possible project, a longer trip in a few months, for 2, with no fixed itinerary, just cities with bookstores and the sea. "I want to see you in many places and still recognize you," he said, and the answer came with a hug that lingered longer than usual. The future didn't need fanfare, it needed an agenda and desire. When the shelter room turned 3 months old, the social project organized an open afternoon of reading. Children read the first sentences of their favorite stories, a woman recited 2 poems from memory, and Laura, at the end, was called to close. She took a breath, looked at the wall with the phrase that had once been a secret in an envelope and was now a guide for so many people, and said she had something to return to that room. She took an envelope from her bag, already yellowed from handling, removed a piece of paper, and didn't read it. She simply explained, with modesty and courage, that those words had been written long ago by someone who loved her the way they knew how, and that, with his consent, she would leave a copy there so that, from time to time, anyone who needed a reminder that love is also a shelter would find an echo. There were no names, no dates. There was a donation of language. At the end, she placed the paper inside a simple frame next to the shelves. Daniel, sitting between 2 chairs, felt his eyes well up, and when the ceremony ended, he approached silently. "Thank you for watching my step when I didn't," Laura said, with the firmness of someone who doesn't confuse repair with starting over. "Thank you for turning what could have become a weapon into shelter," he replied, and they embraced for exactly 1 second, witnessed by books. Each person's outcome, then, settled into what was most concrete. Daniel found a love without fanfare, firm, that didn't require him to sacrifice his own face to fit in, and the dignity with which he bore his grief became the kind of foundation that needs no loud words. Sophia, beside him, confirmed that the most beautiful beginnings don't escape the past, they simply put it to sleep without violence. Laura continued her life in an apartment where the sun met two windows and where the wall bore a reminder: don't romanticize wounds, but heal them. In the workshop, she helped women put names to what they'd experienced, and when someone was tempted to don the guise of an apology, she would say with her newfound wisdom that no one crosses the river carrying their past on their shoulders without sinking. The man of the Dieter lost the chance to become a person in his own story. He remained a brief shadow in some random square, a face without a home in Laura's plot, forgotten with time like drafts that never become text. One late afternoon, Laura entered a bookstore to buy notebooks for the workshop and effortlessly found Daniel and Sophia leafing through new editions at a central table. The encounter didn't ask for the fate of this show, it simply offered the delicacy of a coincidence that fits into 3 smiles. They exchanged a few words about a newly discovered author, laughed at a tacky cover, and in parting, Laura told Sophia that she wished life would treat them with the same kindness they were offering her at that moment. Daniel, holding a thin book that spoke of the seas, uttered a "take care," filled with a friendship that never needed to be named. They left through different doors, and the bell at the entrance rang twice, as if marking the end of an important scene without wanting applause. The final shock didn't come in the form of a scandal, but as a concrete epiphany. Each, in their own way, had learned that true love isn't the shout that wins an argument, it's the hand that lets go when holding on has become violence. Life, pragmatic, moved on, but what those days taught was not lost. The shelter room gained stories on the walls, the sea held new secrets of two people who learned to walk without dragging chains, and the window of the small apartment opened every morning to remind them that the sun keeps shining even when no one calls. What was once hidden in the back of a closet, taped together, became a living phrase in a place where people sit to learn to stand. This is how you close a circle without drawing edges. Now, tell us in the comments what you thought of this story, which part touched you most, and what lesson it taught you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Let me remind you, betrayal never brings victory, it erodes trust, destroys homes, disfigures glances, and what seemed like brightness turns to ash in the hands. Love requires courage, honesty, and choices that sustain the other and yourself. This channel does not support, normalize, or romanticize any kind of betrayal. May the stories serve as a warning, a comfort, and a path.